In 1992, in the middle of one of the worst environmental disasters on the planet, a mayor and a handful of local engineers showed up to the edge of a dying sea with dump trucks full of sand. Their plan was to build a wall of dirt across a strait that had been draining billions of cubic meters of water into a desert where it would simply evaporate. No concrete, no reinforcement, just sand, soil, and sandbags piled up across 13 kilometers of open water. The scientists called it a joke. Government officials in the capital called it a waste of time. The international community had already written the whole region off as a permanent loss, a sacrifice zone that could never come back. And honestly, looking at the numbers, the skeptics had a point. This was the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake on Earth. And by the time those dump trucks arrived, 90% of its water was already gone. The fishing boats sat rusted and stranded 100 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. The fish were dead. The economy was dead. The towns were emptying out. And here were these guys with shovels. But that sand wall did something nobody expected. The water started rising, the salt levels started dropping, and for a few brief years, life crept back into a place that everyone had given up on. Then, in 1999, a spring flood blew the whole thing apart. The wall collapsed. 2 men died, and the water drained right back into the void. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because that failed pile of sand proved something that $100 million worth of consultants had missed. It proved that this sea wanted to come back. It just needed a wall that wouldn't break. Today, the water level in the North Aral Sea is rising. The salt is flushing out, the fish are spawning, and the shoreline is crawling back toward a town that hasn't seen water in decades. To understand why that wall mattered, you have to understand what killed the Aral Sea in the first place. And the answer isn't complicated. Someone turned off the faucet. Starting in the 1950s, the Soviet government decided that Central Asia was going to grow cotton. Not some cotton, all the cotton. They called it white gold, and they wanted the USSR to be completely self-sufficient in it. The problem was that cotton needs enormous amounts of water, and Central Asia is a desert. So Soviet engineers did what Soviet engineers did best. They built big. Over 30,000 kilometers of canals, 45 dams, 80 reservoirs. They rerouted 2 entire rivers, the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya, away from the Aral Sea and into the fields. The canals were a mess. Most of them were just trenches dug through loose sand, no concrete lining, no covers. Water poured out of the sides and evaporated off the top before it ever reached a cotton plant. Somewhere between 1/4 and 3/4 of every drop that entered those canals never made it to a field. It just vanished into the ground or into the air. The Aral Sea had been receiving about 56 billion cubic meters of fresh water every year from those 2 rivers. By the 1980s, in dry years, the inflow dropped to nearly zero. The math was simple and brutal. More water was leaving the lake through evaporation than was coming in, and every year the gap got wider. Here is where the system trapped itself. As the lake shrank, it got shallower. Shallow water heats up faster under the sun, which means it evaporates faster, which means the lake shrinks more, which means it gets even shallower. A loop that feeds on itself, accelerating every year. The salt concentrated. By the late 90s, the southern basin had hit 100 grams of salt per liter, 10 times its original level, saltier than the ocean. Nothing could live in that. In 1987, the water dropped so low that the sea split in 2. A narrow channel called the Berg Strait had been the last connection between the northern and southern halves. When the water fell below that channel, you suddenly had 2 separate lakes. The small Aral in the north inside Kazakhstan, the large Aral in the south inside Uzbekistan, and then came the dust. The exposed seabed, over 60,000 square kilometers of it, became a new desert. They named it the Aralkum. But this wasn't ordinary sand. This was the floor of a lake that had been collecting agricultural runoff for decades. Pesticides, fertilizers, heavy metals, all of it baked into a crust of salt and poison. When the wind picked up, and it picked up often, 10 major storms a year, it launched that crust into the atmosphere. 14 to 27 million tons of toxic dust every single year, ripping across the region. They detected it as far away as the Arctic, as far as the Himalayas. The people who lived around the former sea breathed that dust every day. Rates of respiratory disease skyrocketed. Infant mortality in some districts hit 72 deaths per thousand live births, among the highest in the former Soviet Union. The Aral Sea wasn't just dying, it was poisoning everything around it on the way out. The thing that nobody in Moscow or Almaty seemed to understand, the thing that a local mayor named Tanirbergen Darmanov and a handful of regional engineers figured out on their own, was that the North Aral was a different problem than the South Aral. The south was enormous, shallow, and fed by a river that was almost completely drained by Uzbekistan's cotton fields. That was a political problem, disguised as an environmental one, and it wasn't going to be solved by engineering. But the north still had the Syr Darya flowing into it. The river was diminished, sure, battered by upstream dams and irrigation, but it was still delivering water. The problem was that every drop of Syr Darya water that entered the North Aral immediately drained south through the Berg Strait, flowing into the vast, shallow southern basin where it spread out over thousands of square kilometers and evaporated into nothing. The North Aral was like a bathtub with the drain left open. The faucet was running. There was water coming in. But it was all running straight out the bottom. Darmanov's idea, the one that got him laughed out of meetings, was to plug the drain. Close off the Berg Strait, keep the Syr Darya's water in the north, where the basin was deeper and the surface area was smaller, where the water could actually accumulate instead of spreading thin and cooking off. That first sand dike in 1992 was crude, but it worked. The water rose, the salt dropped. Fish started showing up. For several years, it looked like the crazy idea was actually going to hold. Then, the 1999 flood destroyed the whole structure, killed 2 workers, and dumped years of progress back into the southern desert. But here is the critical detail that the skeptics missed. The failure of the sand dike was not a failure of the concept. It was a failure of the materials. The idea was right. The physics was right. The wall just needed to be built properly. That proof of concept, paid for in sand and blood, is what finally convinced the World Bank and the Kazakh government to put real money behind a real structure. In 2001, they committed $86 million to the Syr Darya Control and Northern Aral Sea project. The centerpiece was a permanent barrier across the Berg Strait, the Kokaral Dam. The Kokaral Dam is 13 kilometers long, made of earth fill reinforced with concrete, and it was completed in August 2005. It works on a principle so simple it almost sounds too basic to be real. The dam is a one-way valve. It traps the Syr Darya's inflow inside the northern basin, which is deeper and has a much smaller surface area than the south. By concentrating the water into a smaller, deeper bowl, you slash the amount of surface exposed to the sun and the wind. Less surface means less evaporation. Less evaporation means the water level actually rises. Think of it this way. Pour a glass of water into a wide, flat baking sheet, and it will evaporate in hours. Pour that same glass of water into a tall, narrow cup, and it lasts for days. The dam turned the North Aral from a baking sheet into a cup. But the engineers weren't reckless about it. They learned from the 1999 disaster. The Kokaral Dam has a 9-gate spillway that can release up to 600 cubic meters per second. During heavy spring floods, when the Syr Darya surges with snowmelt, the gates open and let the excess water flow safely into the southern basin. This prevents the dam from being overtopped and destroyed the way the sand dike was. It also serves a second purpose. Every time the gates open, they flush accumulated salt out of the northern basin, keeping the chemistry balanced. The project didn't stop at the dam itself. The World Bank loan also funded repairs to the Syr Darya's channel and to upstream infrastructure, making sure that more of the river's water actually reached the sea instead of disappearing into leaky canals along the way. The wall was the headline, but the plumbing behind it was just as important. Scientists predicted it would take 3 to 5 years for the North Aral to reach its target water level of 42 meters. They were wrong. It took 7 months. By early 2006, the water had surged up 11 feet, smashing through the projections. The shoreline, which had retreated 100 kilometers from Aralsk, came racing back, stopping just 25 kilometers from the city. And then the biology kicked in. This is where it gets genuinely incredible because the engineers didn't stock a single fish. They didn't plant a single reed. They didn't introduce a single species. All they did was change the water, and nature did everything else. Before the dam, The North Aral's salinity sat at 30 grams per liter, roughly the saltiness of the ocean. The only fish that could survive in that was the Black Sea flounder, a species that had been introduced specifically because it could tolerate extreme salt. Everything else was gone. After the dam, as the Sir Daria's fresh water flooded in and the salt flushed out through the spillway, salinity plummeted. Within a few years, it dropped to 8 grams per liter, almost exactly what the Aral Sea's salinity had been before 1960. And that number, 8 grams per liter, is the threshold. Below 10 grams per liter, native fish species like pike perch, bream, and carp can spawn. Their eggs can survive the salt. Above that threshold, the eggs fail, the larvae die, and the species can't reproduce, no matter how many adults you dump into the water. The dam didn't just bring water back, it brought the chemistry back. And the chemistry brought the fish back. 22 species returned on their own, migrating out of the Sir Daria Delta, where they'd been clinging to survival in the last freshened pockets. Pike perch, the most commercially valuable species, went from functionally extinct in the open sea to the dominant commercial catch. Bream, carp, roach, asp, all of them flooding back into habitat that had been off limits for decades. Meanwhile, the flounder, the last survivor of the salt years, started declining. It was a saltwater fish in a freshwater world now, getting outcompeted by the natives. The fish brought the birds. Reeds sprouted along the new shoreline, and white pelicans began circling over water that had been a salt flat 5 years earlier. Over 300 species now use the restored delta as nesting and migration habitat. On land, the return of water and vegetation brought back wild boars, wolves, and the critically endangered saiga antelope. The reed beds formed a living buffer that trapped moisture and blocked the toxic dust storms that had been shredding the region for decades. The local climate itself started to soften. Humidity ticked up. Dust storms near the northern shore became less frequent. One wall, one change to the plumbing, and the entire system rebooted itself. Stand at the edge of the Kokaral Dam today and you can see the line. On the north side, water, blue-green, wind-chopped, alive. Pelicans circling, fishing boats leaving wakes. On the south side, a white, cracked plain stretching to the horizon. Salt crust, silence. Two completely different worlds, separated by 13 kilometers of concrete and earth. The numbers tell the story in a way that adjectives can't. The water level in the North Aral has risen 12 meters from its lowest point. The volume of water has nearly doubled, climbing from about 14 billion cubic meters to over 27 billion. Salinity has dropped from 30 grams per liter to between 8 and 10, a 73% reduction. The surface area has expanded by over 600 square kilometers, meaning 600 square kilometers of toxic desert are now back underwater. The fishing industry went from 0 to 8,000 tons of annual catch, from 0 processing plants to 12, from fewer than 500 fishermen to over 3,000. In the village of Tastubek, the number of houses has tripled. Young families who had migrated to cities like Almaty are moving back. That's a reverse migration, and in rural Central Asia, where everyone is leaving for the cities, that is almost unheard of. The fish coming out of the North Aral aren't just feeding local markets anymore. Pike perch is being exported to Russia, the European Union, and China. The Aral Fresh Fish Processing Plant in Aralsk is certified for international export. A town that was dying of dust poisoning 20 years ago is now shipping fish to European restaurants, and they're not done. Kazakhstan has already launched Phase 2. The plan is to raise the Kokaral Dam by another 2 meters, pushing the target water level from 42 meters to 44. That would expand the sea's volume from 27 billion cubic meters to 34 billion, and push the surface area to nearly 4,000 square kilometers. If the projections hold, the sea will reach the old harbor walls of Aralsk itself for the first time in decades. To get there, the government has kicked off 167 separate engineering projects to modernize the irrigation systems along the entire Sir Daria. Concrete lining for canals that have been leaking water into the sand for 50 years. Automated monitoring stations to track every cubic meter of flow. Subsidies to convert over 1 million hectares of farmland to drip irrigation and sprinkler systems. The goal is to save 500 million cubic meters of water per year, water that is currently being wasted and redirect it into the sea. The South Aral, on the other side of that dam, is a different story. Uzbekistan's economy still runs on cotton. The Amu Darya is still drained dry before it reaches the southern basin. In 2014, the eastern half of the South Aral evaporated completely. Where there was once a sea, Uzbekistan is now drilling for natural gas. The contrast between north and south is the sharpest possible illustration of what happens when you fight the physics versus when you surrender to it. The Aral Sea will never return to its 1960 footprint. 68,000 square kilometers of water is gone, and most of it is not coming back. But the North Aral proves something that matters more than the size of the lake. It proves that a system everyone wrote off as permanently dead can be restarted with the right intervention at the right point. The Kokaral Dam isn't a miracle of technology. It's a 13-kilometer wall that does one thing. It keeps water in a deep bowl instead of letting it spread across a shallow desert and evaporate. The engineering is simple, the physics is simple. Concentrate your resource where it does the most good and stop wasting it where it does the least. Gravity and geometry did the rest. Sometimes the most powerful piece of engineering isn't the most complex one. Sometimes it's just a wall in the right place. If the mechanics of reshaping broken landscapes interest you, subscribe. There are deserts being held back by straw, wastelands reversed by orange peels, and dead zones rebuilt with nothing but holes in the ground. The engineering behind each one is just as satisfying as this.